Hello and greetings from New York. My name is Linda Behnke and I'm an Associate Legal Officer at the Division for Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea of the UN's Office of Legal Affairs. This is kind of a long name, so we also refer to our office by the acronym DOALOS. I'm here today with my colleague Michele Ameri, who is a legal officer at DOALOS and is covering fisheries issues. He will talk about the fish stocks agreement in a minute. But first, we wanted to thank the CITES Secretariat for inviting us to participate in this workshop, and we are sorry that we are not able to attend in person. But we hope that you will find this presentation useful. It will cover the UN Fish Stocks Agreement and the BBNJ Agreement and their relationship to CITES. But before we move into the specifics of the Fish Stocks Agreement and the BBNJ Agreement, let me take a minute to situate these agreements within the broader context of the law of the sea and ocean governance. The key treaty in this respect is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is commonly referred to by the acronym UNCLOS. UNCLOS is also known as the Constitution for the Ocean, as it sets out the legal framework within which all activities in the oceans and seas must be carried out. It specifies the limits of the various maritime zones, as well as the rights and obligations of states in those zones. UNCLOS currently has 169 parties, including the European Union. And until recently, there were two implementing agreements to UNCLOS. First, there's the 1994 agreement relating to the implementation of Part 11 of UNCLOS, which addresses the exploration for and exploitation of mineral resources in the international seabed area. And the second implementing agreement is the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement, which relates to the conservation and sustainable use of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks, which we will talk about in more detail in a minute. And with the adoption of the BBNJ agreement in June 2023, the birth was given to the third implementing agreement to UNCLOS. This means that both the Fish Stocks Agreement and the BBNJ agreement must be interpreted and applied in the context of and in a manner consistent with UNCLOS. Considering the topic of this workshop, you are likely well familiar with the concept of marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. Nevertheless, it may be useful to recall which maritime zones constitute these areas beyond national jurisdiction, since this term is very important for both agreements. The majority of the provisions of the Fish Stocks Agreement apply to areas beyond national jurisdiction, and the BBNJ agreement applies exclusively in these areas. So, areas beyond national jurisdiction refers to two maritime zones defined under UNCLOS. And these are highlighted in yellow on the slide that you see. The first is the high seas, which include all parts of the seas that are not included in the exclusive economic zone, the territorial sea, or the internal waters of a state, or in the archipelagic waters of an archipelagic state. And the second maritime zone, which is sometimes forgotten, but also very important, is the international seabed area, also known as the area with a capital A. And this is the seabed and the ocean floor and the subsoil thereof beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. So together, these two maritime zones are the areas beyond national jurisdiction, and by surface area, they cover over 2/3 of the ocean. So a very large area of the planet. And here it's also important to note that the CITES, in its definition of introduction from the sea, uses a slightly different term, namely marine environment not under the jurisdiction of any state. CITES Resolution 14.6 on introduction from the sea clarified that this term is to be understood in accordance with international law as reflected in UNCLOS. Therefore, to ensure uniformity of the legal system, the term marine environment not under the jurisdiction of any state must be understood to be equivalent to areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that was it in part of introduction. Now I'm handing over to my colleague Michele to present on the fish stocks agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. The United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, whose full title is on the screen before you, specifically addresses the conservation and management of marine living resources. While not universal, its participation includes most states engaged in fishing for straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks on the high seas, as well as many coastal states with an interest in the same stocks. Building on the convention, it provides a more detailed legal regime for implementing the obligations of states to cooperate in the conservation and management for these stocks, as well as high sea stocks more generally. While the bulk of its provisions relate to the management of these stocks in areas beyond national jurisdiction, some key provisions are also applicable to areas within national jurisdiction. This is because straddling stocks and highly migratory fish stocks require international cooperation to ensure their effective and efficient management and long-term sustainability. The last point is due to the nature of these stocks. Straddling fish stocks are stocks that can be found within a coastal state's jurisdiction and in the adjacent high seas areas. That is to say, the stocks straddle the limits of coastal state jurisdiction. Highly migratory species travel large distances across the ocean in and out of different exclusive economic zones and the high seas. While in areas under national jurisdiction, the responsibility for managing such stocks falls to coastal states. On the high seas, there's a qualified freedom of fishing, which puts the onus on flag states to cooperate in taking measures to ensure their sustainable use. If such stocks are not efficiently managed in both areas, that is, throughout their range, they are vulnerable to overexploitation. The full and effective implementation of the agreement contributes to the long-term sustainability of global fish stocks, combating IUU fishing, and I'll note that although this term is not found in either the convention or the agreement, both instruments provide the legal basis for addressing illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Meeting global commitments on fisheries, such as those found in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and relevant General Assembly resolutions, maintaining and strengthening the current system of regional governance for high seas fisheries, most particularly through regional fisheries management organizations and arrangements, RFMOs, strengthening the inclusiveness and transparency and effectiveness of such organizations, and addressing current and future challenges through processes established pursuant to the agreement. In order to achieve these objectives, the agreement establishes different categories of obligations. To start with, there are general obligations for the conservation and management of covered stocks with a view to ensuring their sustainability. These obligations largely flow from the Convention. They include obligations to adopt measures to ensure long-term sustainability and promote optimum utilization, that such measures be based on the best scientific evidence available and are designed to maintain or restore stocks at levels capable of producing maximum sustainable yield. There is also an obligation to prevent or eliminate overfishing and excess fishing capacity. There are also obligations to assess impacts of fishing on associated and dependent species where necessary, adopting measures to conserve and manage the species. Similarly, there are obligations to minimize pollution, protect marine biodiversity, and collect and share fisheries-related data. There is a detailed provision on the application of the precautionary approach and a requirement for states to cooperate to ensure the compatibility of measures adopted within and beyond areas of national jurisdiction. Then there are a set of obligations regarding how to meet the conservation and management obligations, including through RFMOs. These include minimum standards for RFMO establishment and performance, flag state responsibility, cooperation in compliance and enforcement, including through RFMOs and port states, and the requirements of developing states. Finally, the agreement provided for the convening of a review conference 4 years after its entry into force to assess the effectiveness of its provisions and propose means of strengthening the substance and methods of implementation of the agreement. At the end of the first session in 2006, it was decided to suspend the conference so as to continue to periodically review implementation of the agreement. The conference has been resumed in 2010, 2016, and 2023. At the end of each resumption, the conference has adopted an extensive set of recommendations regarding actions to be taken by states and RFMOs to strengthen implementation of the agreement. The informal consultations of states parties to the agreement is another forum for states, IGOs, and NGOs to review and discuss implementation of the agreement. Since 2018, the ICSP has been focusing each session on a specific substantive topic relevant to the implementation of the agreement. So how does this relate to the work being undertaken by CITES? As one can see in this helpful table prepared by FAO, there's a correlation between finishing management instruments and approaches and CITES obligations and measures, although the tools and terminology differ significantly. In particular, we can note the consistency in the high-level objective of both frameworks. If one were to point at some consideration, there's a concern with the sustainability of stocks and protection of biodiversity in both cases. UNSA, of course, is limited to specific categories of fish stocks, primarily when on the high seas. Some stocks covered under the Fish Stocks Agreement have been listed in Appendix-II to CITES. The review conference on the agreement has discussed CITES listing and adopted recommendations, for example, on the conservation and management of sharks and seabirds. The cooperation requirements in the agreement are implemented largely through RFMOs, which manage specific stocks in specific areas, and also play a role in the implementation of some of the CITES provisions. The regimes are mutually reinforcing, but cooperation, coordination, and consistency in implementation should be promoted. One concrete example of where consistency and coordination are being sought is with regard to non-detriment findings for species listed in Annexes 1 or 2 of CITES, introduced from the sea, that is, in most cases, caught on the high seas. There, the Conference of Parties of CITES in Resolution 14.6 on introduction from the sea considered that states of introduction, states of export, and states of import should take into account whether or not a specimen was or will be acquired and landed in a manner consistent and applicable with measures under international law for the conservation and management of marine living resources, including those of any other treaty, convention, or agreement, with conservation and management measures for the marine species in question. In this regard, the work being undertaken by FAO with different RFMOs to consider such questions are particularly noteworthy. And at this point, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to present, and I'd like to pass the floor back to my colleague, Linda, to present on the BBNJ agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. So now we will look at the BBNJ agreement, the official title of which is Agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. So this is a long title, but we wanted to make sure that you've heard it at least once during this presentation. The adoption by consensus of this agreement in June 2023 was hailed as a historic achievement among states, civil society, and the media. The agreement opened for signature on 20th September 2023. The UN Secretary General urged all states to spare no effort to ensure that the agreement enters into force. As of today, the BBNJ agreement has 89 signatories, including 88 states and the European Union. 4 signatories have become parties to the agreement to date. This slide shows the distribution of these signatories by UN regional groups. And the majority of the signatories to the BBNJ agreement, namely 81 out of the 89 signatories, are also parties to the CITES. Therefore, it is imperative to understand the relationship between the two treaties and the implications they have for one another. So before I dive into the substantive provisions of the BBNJ agreement, I would like to highlight one cross-cutting issue that is important to understand from the outset. And this is the relationship between the BBNJ agreement and the relevant legal instrument and frameworks and relevant global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies, which are referred to by the acronym IFBs. So IFB standing for Instruments, Framework, and Bodies. Presumably, these IFBs include the CITES, which means that the following rules would apply in relation to CITES. First, the BBNJ agreement foresees that it shall be interpreted and applied in a manner that does not undermine relevant instrument frameworks and bodies, and in a manner that promotes coherence and coordination with those IFBs. Second, parties are required to cooperate, including through strengthening and enhancing cooperation with and among relevant IFBs, and to endeavor to promote the objectives of the agreement in decision-making under relevant IFBs. So now let's take a look at what is actually in the BBNJ agreement. The agreement addresses a package of 4 key issues under the overall objective of ensuring the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. The agreement also addresses a number of cross-cutting issues. And now I will go through the 4 key issues in a little bit more detail. First, the BBNJ agreement sets up a framework for the fair and equitable sharing of monetary and non-monetary benefits arising from activities with respect to marine genetic resources of areas beyond national jurisdiction and digital sequence information on such resources. The provision on marine genetic resources may overlap with the CITES provisions on introduction from the sea, especially in cases where the collection of samples of marine genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction includes specimens of species that are protected under the CITES Appendices-I or II. This is the case, for example, with regard to species listed under Appendix-I, since CITES prohibits the issuance of introduction from sea certificates for Appendix-I species that are to be used for primarily commercial purposes. On the other hand, the BBNJ agreement allows for commercial use of marine genetic resources and the digital sequence information on such resources, as long as the requirements under the agreement are met. And there are no restrictions under the BBNJ agreements with regard to species threatened with extinction. So the second key issue are measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. The BBNJ agreement provides for procedures for the establishment, implementation, monitoring, and review of area-based management tools, including marine protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The indicative criteria for identifying such areas includes those relevant to endangered species, such as, for example, the importance of the area for threatened, endangered, or declining species or habitats, and the special importance of the area for the life history stages of species. And the third key issue are environmental impact assessments. The BBNJ agreement further operationalizes UNCLOS provisions on environmental impact assessments for areas beyond national jurisdiction and establishes processes, thresholds, and other requirements for conducting and reporting such assessments by parties. And environmental impact assessments are also referred to by the acronym EIA. So there's lots of acronyms in this agreement. We try to minimize the use, but sometimes it's useful to have them. So this can help ensure that the impacts on marine species listed in the CITES appendices, including potential cumulative impacts, are assessed and considered before decision is made about whether a certain activity may proceed. Moreover, we can see a link between EIAs and the topic of this workshop, since there's some overlap between non-detriment findings and environmental impact assessment. The BBNJ agreement contains an obligation for parties to ensure that the potential impacts on the marine environment of planned activities under their jurisdiction or control that take place in areas beyond national jurisdiction are assessed before they're authorized. And this then raises the question whether and how non-detriment findings under CITES can work in synergy with the provisions on EIAs. The BBNJ agreement provides that it is not necessary to conduct an EIA if the potential impacts of the planned activity have been assessed in accordance with the requirements of another legal instrument, framework, or body, if the assessment undertaken is equivalent to the one required under the BBNJ agreement, or certain other criteria are met. This is a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is that there's a possibility that a non-detriment finding under CITES may replace an EIA for certain activities and under certain circumstances. But of course, it is too early to say that for sure, as it will be up to the parties to both agreements to make such a determination and work out its details. So at this point, we are really raising more questions than answers, but we think that it is useful to start thinking about those questions. And as a final point on this issue, I would like to come back to CITES Resolution 14.6 on Introduction from the Sea, which Michele already mentioned, and which requires states to determine whether or not specimens taken from areas beyond national jurisdiction will be acquired or landed in a manner consistent with other treaties, conventions, or agreements. And we just wanted to point out that once the BBNJ agreement enters into force, states may have to consider compliance with the BBNJ agreements in this respect, in particular with regard to the rules on marine genetic resources, on environmental impact assessment, or on the rules of area-based management tools that may be established in the future in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So now we get to the fourth and last key issue, which is capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. The agreement provides for the obligations of parties to cooperate in capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, and it sets out various modalities to that end. The indicative and non-exhaustive list of types of such activities includes, among others, information dissemination and awareness raising with regard to environmental and biological information collected through research in areas beyond national jurisdiction and stressors on the ocean that affect marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So these are the four key issues explained very briefly. The agreement also addresses a number of cross-cutting issues, but unfortunately, we won't have time to address these in detail in this presentation. So now I will just say very few words about the institutional arrangements. The agreement establishes a number of bodies, including a Conference of the Parties, or COP, a scientific and technical body, a secretariat, a clearinghouse mechanism, and other subsidiary bodies. The agreement also addresses other cross-cutting issues, such as implementation and compliance, funding, and dispute settlement. So now, let me say a few words about the next steps. The agreement will remain open for signature until 20th September 2025, and it will enter into force 120 days after the deposit of the 60th instrument of ratification, approval, acceptance, or accession. The first meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the agreement will be convened no later than 1 year after its entry into force. I wish to note that the UN General Assembly is expected to adopt on 24 April 2024 a resolution on the establishment of a preparatory commission to prepare for the entry into force of the agreement and for the convening of the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the agreement. Since this is a pre-recorded presentation, we have a bit of a time lag, but by the time you actually see the presentation, the resolution should have been adopted, all things going as planned. The Commission will also first hold an organizational meeting, which will take place in New York from 24 to 26 June 2024. The agreement also requires that the Secretary General, through DOALOS, performs the interim secretariat functions until the new secretariat commences its functions. In Resolution 77/321 of August last year, the UN General Assembly approved the assumption by the Secretary General of the functions assigned to him under the agreement, and this includes the performance of the secretariat functions that I just mentioned. In response to the request of that resolution, DOALOS is currently implementing a program of activities to promote a better understanding of the agreement and prepare for its entry into force. These will include, among others, regional workshops, technical assistance at the national level, briefings and side events, the participation in relevant workshops like this one, and the development of tools and outreach materials. Besides activities supported by the UN regular budget, DOALOS is also receiving support from the European Union to implement a number of activities over the next 2 years. In performing its functions, DOALOS will aim to strengthen coordination and cooperation, including with CITES and other relevant stakeholders. So this concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, and since we are not able to be there in person, we would like to encourage you to email us at doalos@un.org. It's also displayed on the screen, the email address. If you would like to learn more in more detail about the different parts of the BBNJ agreement, I would recommend you to watch the recordings of the online briefings that DOALOS is conducting as part of our BBNJ Deep Dive series. 3 of these briefing sessions are already online, and they include one providing an overview of the BBNJ agreement, 1 session on marine genetic resources, and 1 on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. The next briefing will cover environmental impact assessment, and it's coming up on 7 May 2024. And all information related to these briefings and to DOALOS' other activities can be found on our temporary website, which the link to which is displayed on the next slide. So thank you very much, and we hope you found this useful, and we hope to get to meet you in person one day. Thanks a lot.